It was once said that Hitler shook the trees and America picked up the apples. Musicians, writers, and artists, many of whom came here to Los Angeles to begin a new life. But the story wasn't that simple. Exile created a special form of life for which few were prepared, turning Hollywood of the 1930s and 40s into a sort of palm tree purgatory. Some of the exiles were famous, others never had their chance. But all of them wrote letters and kept journals in which they confided their feelings about being caught between two worlds. This diary was discovered, author unknown. I'm happy, but not content. Under the bright blue sky of California live the German and Austrian émigrés. Alive by the skin of our teeth, we can work, perform our music in the famous Hollywood Bowl, or collaborate with the film industry. Live in the glamorous atmosphere of Pacific Palisades, Bel Air, Hollywood, and Palm Springs. And long for our European homeland from which we had to flee. Displaced persons in paradise.
Behind me lay the Via Dolorosa of all those who had fled from Hitler's regime. It led from Germany to Holland, Belgium, northern France, from Paris across the Pyrenees, to Spain and Portugal. Only a few of us had valid passports or visas. I arrived a few months before on a freighter from Lisbon and knew little English. It was as though I had been dropped, deaf and dumb, from another planet. Indeed, America was another planet, for Europe was at war.
Before its descent into madness, Berlin had been a city bursting with fresh intellectual and artistic life. Old conventions and old traditions were replaced with big, daring, and fantastic ideas. A new generation of writers, composers, directors, and painters were creating the modern world. But the Nazis had other plans for them.
And I will never forget, Goebbels was a very, very clever man. He was indescribably charming when I entered. He told me a lot of things. Among other things, he told me that the Führer and he had seen Metropolis. And the Führer had said, this is the man who will give us the Nazi film. I was very much perspiring at this moment, but I said, Herr Minister, I'm tickled pink. What else should I have said? And I left him. And then I went home, and I decided to leave the same evening Berlin, which I loved very, very much.
Culture was now in the hands of Hitler's own Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels.
Der früher oft gegen uns vorgebrachte Einwand, es gäbe keine Möglichkeit, die Juden aus dem Kunst- und Kulturleben zu beseitigen, weil deren zu viele seien und wir die leeren Plätze nicht neu besetzen könnten, ist glänzend widerlegt worden.
I went to see General Secretary of the Salzburg Festival and the director of the Vienna Opera. And I presented myself. You have treated me very kindly. Can I expect to be hired by the Vienna Opera? Is there going to be a vacancy, and if so? He said, Lansdorf, if you come to me one of these days and the rosary will hang out of your pocket, I may be able to engage you. And I said, Dr. Kerber, the price is a little bit too high for me. I don't think I can afford that.
they go after the artists and the musicians and the writers right away in 1933. The result is, ironically, that the artists get out, by and large. The ones who come to the United States tend to divide into different groups. I would say the architects go to Chicago, the artists tend to stay in New York, and the writers and the musicians tend to, not all of them, but many of them, come to Los Angeles.
I'd never seen Hollywood before. There was a garden, there was a swimming pool and a tennis court with those beautiful girls played ball, tennis, swam in the thing. I said, that's Hollywood. Fabulous.
One day for lunch, I came out there and there was a private dining room and some gentlemen standing around having a cocktail. And somebody says, let's sit down. And my host said, you sit here. I sat down. I don't believe it till today. I looked to my left, there's Clark Gable. Looked to the right, there's Spencer Tracy. I said, if my friends in Berlin could only see me now.
We had a really wonderful little gallery in the middle of Beverly Hills. One morning, Stravinsky came in and said, do you mind if I wait here? Some friends of mine are going to join me. We'll go next door to a place called Delhaven's, which is a coffee clutch kind of place. And Huxley came in. Well, I'd met him, and then I was doing a picture with Franz Werfel called The Song of Bernadette. And he came in, and I thought, well, this is a cozy little group of Russians and Germans and so forth, English. And then in came Rachmaninoff. That impressed me quite a lot. And then Thomas Mann wandered in. And then I began to really be sort of depressed by the impressiveness of this group. And then the last one, I think, who came in was Schoenberg. And that did it. I just walked out. I said, you boys, make yourselves at home, shut the door when you leave, and go and have your cup of coffee.
Another reason they come is the kind of age-old German interest in the Mediterranean. I mean, Thomas Mann comes. This is the Thomas Mann who wrote Death in Venice. And he lives on San Remo. The particular neighborhood that many of them end up living in is the Palisades Riviera.
We lived in a nicely situated house with a garden and a swimming pool. The surrounding landscape is truly like Tuscany. I have what I have always dreamed of. Beautiful weather every day. I started to write again on the first day. Life would be more peaceful if we were not afraid that the agony we have already lived through could be exceeded by even worse news at any time.
Musicians were welcomed with open arms by Hollywood. And in return, German and Austrian émigrés players made studio orchestras among the best in the world. A weekly paycheck for recording original music for the movies. The most influential composer of film scores was the Viennese prodigy Erich Wolfgang Korngold, whose early opera, Die Tote Stadt, had taken the German avant-garde by storm. Then, his symphonic film scores changed the sound of Hollywood. Korngold had returned home to Vienna in the fall of 1937 to work on his newest opera. But within a matter of a few months, just before Hitler's army marched into Austria, Korngold had to return to Los Angeles, bringing his wife and 2 children. It would be 11 long years before they would return to Vienna, their home, possessions, and many of their friends lost.
Schoenberg said he never saw so many people from Vienna as he saw in Los Angeles. They're all bunched together in these elegant places from Santa Monica to Beverly Hills. Well, in the early days, he played tennis with George Gershwin up to the day he died, practically. At the very beginning, he met the Marx Brothers, Charlie Chaplin, Fanny Bryce, Thomas Mann on a few occasions, some of the others who lived in the neighborhood.
We hardly got a chance to hear his music, but when we did, there were such overwhelmingly wonderful moments. Whatever happened to him that didn't go well, and whatever sufferings he had because his music was not played and because he was not recognized and because when he went to the tennis club, someone came up to him and said, "Oh, Mr. Schoenberg, I know who you are." "Really?" Says, "Yes, you're Ronnie Schoenberg's father." And Ronnie was a good tennis player. In spite of all of these things, he was so grateful to have been able to come to the United States and escape from Nazi Germany and not have to end up in a concentration camp. He was very proud of being an American citizen. That meant a lot to him.
Stravinsky incidentally said that Hollywood and Los Angeles was the center of the musical world, which indeed it was. Certainly when he was alive, when Schoenberg was alive, and when people like Korngold were here, and Toch, conductors, Bruno Walter, violinists, Heifetz, cellist Piatigorsky, and earlier Rubinstein. It was an incredible place.
In fact, I was at one evening where they played in a private home in Beverly Hills, and just before intermission, Arthur Rubinstein, whom I knew, winked at me and said, "Not bad for local talent, is it?"
We drove along Pico Boulevard, a straight boulevard leading to the ocean. The highway rose to a hilltop and we could see a bright silvery glimmer. We found ourselves on the rim of a canyon. Below was a highway with beach houses. The canyon was surrounded by hills covered with shrubs and trees. On our left was a pier, a gaudy building that harbored a merry-go-round. It had the most magnificent fierce horses carved in wood and painted by a real artist. They looked like steeds of a great general. Everything was so lovely and peaceful. The people on the pier, the merry-go-round, and the swaying boats. I begged my husband Bertolt to let us live in Santa Monica.
Salka Viertel had been an actress in Max Reinhardt's troupe, a great actress back in Germany. It is fairly representative of one of these histories. She marries one of the great directors of the time, Bertolt Viertel, who comes to America, become a film director here. And she comes and can't find work as an actress, but she begins to find work as a screenwriter, and specifically becomes Greta Garbo's screenwriter. She has a house on Mayberry, which Gordon Davidson lives in now.
People used to gather here in the house every Sunday. They would dress kind of formally, but they often bring food because no one had a lot of money, you know. So they brought food, and they had a kind of communal table. It was many dinners took place here. Probably the most famous was Garbo, and she stayed in the room at the top of the stairs, which later became my son's room. And Arnold Schoenberg, Bertolt Brecht, who actually stayed in the back house, guest house, and Charlie Chaplin used to come here. You name it, in that circle. Not only just the German refugees or exiles, but the other circle of people around that. So it was a wonderful frisson that existed here, and they probably sat and complained about America and politics and art and movies.
The flora and fauna do their part to give life on the Pacific its friendly colors. In California, the roses bloom several times a year. Over and over they start at the very beginning and run through their cycle to the very end. It's as if they wanted to tell the exhausted, discouraged human beings around them, you just have to want it, and life will start again. The person who's doing badly lives here in decidedly more comfortably sad conditions than anywhere else. Misery is surrounded by blooming roses, and once in a while a hummingbird floats gently by.
When I came to Hollywood, this was a trip in which I was actually under contract to Metro, and my wife and I took a house on the beach, the Malibu section, and we found out that right next door in a little cottage lived Hans Zeisl with his wife Lou.
In Germany, Hans Zeisl had collaborated with Bertolt Brecht. His themes, his passions, were for the working man. His most sung work was the Solidarity Song, the militant anthem of street protests.
He, Alban Berg, and Webern were the three great students of Schoenberg. And Hans had such respect for Schoenberg. I remember saying, he is a man who heard sounds that no one had heard before. Hans did quite a few pictures here. He did a picture with Cary Grant. He may have done one for Fritz Lang, Hangmen Also Die. There were a couple of other pictures. You know, he kept busy. I never knew whether Hans was happy or unhappy with his work in Hollywood or with whatever picture he did, because he kept up this wonderful, amiable front with this mask of wit all the time. For my own part, I know being in their presence, one had another way of looking at things. I think it absolutely, if I may say so, elevated my way of looking at things to a more, to use Hans Eisl's words, modern way.
What is homelessness? My home is in the works that I took with me. They are the German language and style of thought, the traditional treasures of my country and people. Where I am, there is Germany. Exile creates a special form of life. The various reasons for banishment make little difference. The sharing of a common fate are more fundamental than such nuances of opinion, and people find their way to one another.
The intellectual side of the émigré community gravitated to the palatial home of Leon Feuchtwanger and his wife, Martha. An intellectual giant of the stature of Thomas Mann, Feuchtwanger was a best-selling novelist in Germany and in America. One of the first to speak out against Hitler in Germany, he kept his voice raised during his years in Los Angeles.
Leon Feuchtwanger and his wife Martha lived in a villa overlooking the coast of the Pacific Ocean. Even though it was only he and his wife who lived in this villa, he also needed enormous space because he was one of the great book collectors in the world. And Leon loved his books. They were all over this enormous house. My wife once asked Mrs. Feuchtwanger, Martha, how do you keep them dusted? And Martha said, Leon reads them, you know. We're talking about thousands of books.
I heard from Mrs. Feuchtwanger that Brecht was there quite a lot. After all, they had worked together. Brecht was difficult because he was unhappy in Los Angeles. The Thomas Manns were close friends. The Heinrich Manns were close friends. From what I saw of the marriage, they were very close, but he was very dictatorial. And she always walked several paces behind him, which some of us found interesting and odd. And then there was a turtle that walked behind her. The turtle stayed on. The turtle was there right up to the end.
A gathering would begin in this library at 8 p.m. Feuchtwanger would read from one of his most recent works to guests that included Heinrich and Thomas Mann, Bertolt Brecht, Bruno and Liesl Frank, Theodor Adorno, Franz Werfel, and his wife, Alma Mahler-Werfel. Thomas Mann often led the discussions, followed by apple strudel, served downstairs. Evenings ended early, however, as Mann wanted to be in bed by 11 o'clock.
This unique, one-of-a-kind dartboard was found in the organ room. And wouldn't you just love to guess which one of those great artists and names created which one of those many holes?
Bruno Walter's fame was such that he had no problem finding work with the best American orchestras. But he knew many of his fellow exiles were still struggling for their lives.
I am thankful for the sun's warmth, which beautifies life in this part of America, but much of the time is absorbed in the innumerable demands from musicians and other refugees to procure them jobs or visas or affidavits. I suffer from my inability to help.
Yes, that's a very interesting story, how my parents, composer Erich Zeisl and Gertrude Zeisl, how they got the affidavit. My mother, they didn't know a soul in New York, and so my mother got the New York telephone book and wrote pleading letters to all the Zeisels, Z-E-I-S-Ls, that were in the phone book. There was one name that seemed very important to her, and it was a Zeisl with, after it, PLB, the letters PLB, and she thought that this must be a very important man with letters after his name, and it turned out that this PLB was a Morris Zeisl, a plumber, and he was the only one that responded to all those letters and sent an affidavit.
It's very important to remember that through that whole period, there was a pretty much as tight as possible an embargo on Jews coming to America. The State Department was filled with anti-Semites, and Roosevelt, for his part, did not want to upset the basically isolationist Americans as he tried to gradually move them into the war. There was a quota for Eastern Europeans and Central Europeans in the United States, and between 1933 and 1945, that quota went unfilled. They did not let in the number they were legally supposed to. They were consciously blocking them.
My father, Erich Zeisl, came to Los Angeles actually in 1942, but he had to flee Austria on the day after Kristallnacht, that is November 10th, 1938. His father and mother, they were both taken probably to Treblinka, but they were put into the gas chamber. And he didn't find this out until 1944, when he got a commission to write music for the 92nd Psalm. And he was so grieved by this in the world situation that this 92nd Psalm became a requiem and shows the great sadness that he felt for his father and for the countless victims of the Holocaust. And although he had success in the movies, he had a job, he had no recognition. And in New York, when he first arrived, there was some publicity, and he had some radio performances. And then when he came to Los Angeles, that was it, and taught at City College, but had performances, but very, very, very seldom. And if you consider that a giant like Schoenberg was neglected here, you can imagine how bad it was for someone who was just starting out.
Those hounded out of Germany were not only of every political stripe, but also of every social class and personal character. Now, whether they liked it or not, they all had the same label stamped on their foreheads. They were immigrants first, and only after that were they the people they really were.
One of the most famous exiles, and the most prickly, was the left-wing revolutionary playwright Bertolt Brecht.
He takes the last train across Russia, comes from Vladivostok, and makes it into LA Harbor. You would think he'd be a little bit grateful. He's sour from the minute he arrives.
Brecht had this look about him. He looked like a person who was imprisoned as a refugee. That is to say, he had closely cut hair. He would wear denims, denim pants, denim jacket, and a work shirt. And he would smoke these terrible nickel cigars. But there was about him always the look of a person who would be marched off to a concentration camp. He had that look. The mind was something else.
I feel as if I have been exiled from our era. This is Tahiti in the form of a big city. At this very moment, I am looking out onto a little garden with a lawn, shrubs with red blossoms, a palm tree, and white garden furniture. And a male voice is singing something sentimental to piano accompaniment. They have nature here, Indeed, since everything is so artificial, they even have an exaggerated feeling for nature, which becomes alienated. From Dietrich's house, you can see the San Fernando Valley, an incessant, brilliantly illuminated stream of cars thunder through nature. But they tell you that all the greenery is wrestled from the desert by irrigation systems. Scratch the surface a little and the desert shows through. The butchery, 15,000 kilometers away, which is deciding our fate right across Europe at its broadest point, is only an echo in the hubbub of the art market here.
Brecht pitches his share of pitches to Hollywood, only one of which gets made. I mean, this is arguably one of the great playwrights of the 20th century. He's in Los Angeles offering plays. None of them are getting made. On the other hand, you have to have some pity for the studio execs. There's a famous story about him, coming in for a pitch meeting, and Brecht's at the front of the table, and he's got them all around. Yes, what is he going to suggest now? And he's suggesting a movie about the history of bread. You're just kind of going, bread? The workers, the wheat,
Hollywood. Every day to earn my bread, I go to the market where lies are bought. Hopefully, I line up with the sellers.
The famous story is of Schoenberg, when Irving Thalberg, the great head of the studio, is going to be doing a huge production of Pearl Buck's The Good Earth. And he says, well, who's the greatest composer in town right now? And he's told Schoenberg's the greatest composer, so he has Schoenberg come in.
I like to think it's true that when he met with Thalberg, Thalberg told him, laid out what The Good Earth was all about, and he said that there's this huge scene, and there's fighting here, and this going on here, and this going on there, and just think of the wonderful music you can compose for that. And that my father said, with all that going on, who needs music? But I think really what he wanted to do was he saw all these things happening, and he wanted to control everything, as he did with his music. And with The Good Earth, I think, or any movie, if he was going to be involved in it, he wanted to see that it was unified and that everything worked together. When he realized that he couldn't do that, then he said, this isn't going to be very good if I have to rely on somebody else, and it isn't going to be the creation that I envision.
I'm sitting here in the Hollywood branch of the Los Angeles Public Library. This is what we have instead of cafe in the afternoon. For what is one to do in this desert of drugstores and rooms masquerading as houses? Here, one experiences what exile really is, with regard to charity, too. For soon, when I lose my unemployment money in 3 weeks, I will have reached that point.
There's an old story the émigrés used to tell about two dachshunds who are walking on the Palisades. One of them says to the other, it's true, here I'm a dachshund, but in the old country I was a St. Bernard.
We got on well with Thomas Mann and saw him and his wife often. But all of us really liked his brother Heinrich better. He had a very difficult time of it here. He was only known in Hollywood for the movie The Blue Angel, and he made nothing from it. He used to say, "My fame in America consists of the legs of Marlene Dietrich." He was supported by his brother Thomas and by my husband Leon Furchtwanger without him ever knowing it.
He was an extremely distinguished man of letters in the old European tradition. He was nearly 70 when he went across to Los Angeles, and his reputation, which had stood much higher than his brother's in the early years after the First World War, had begun to be eclipsed by Thomas Mann's reputation.
But Heinrich could not write. He sat in that room day after day and didn't write a word. Partly because I think he felt like a fish out of water, and partly he would only write in German, and he didn't know what to do.
The writers were deprived of their language and also deprived of the context in which they were used to working. I mean, they were not used to turning up and sitting on a corridor in the writer's block in Warner Brothers or Paramount and writing on assignment.
To see Heinrich Mann in this environment is exhausting. He is nothing but unsuccessful. He does not have the money to call a doctor, and his heart is exhausted. His wife, Nellie, only 45, vulgar and with a rough prettiness, works at a laundry and drinks. Both are sitting in a very small, stuffy villa without garden in Hollywood, with cheap furniture and Mann's little number of books which were saved. After his wife's suicide, he seemed to drag himself around Hollywood, a penniless, solitary figure, a horrible sight to see. Disappointments and sorrows render me frustrated and lonesome. I have become somehow reluctant to go on writing, if my work remains more or less paper on desks and on shelves.
In the case of my grandfather, Ernst Krenek, who had been a modernist composer, a new Musik as it was called, he rather quickly gets typecast as a specialist in horror effects, in chase scenes. Virtually all the chase scenes out of Paramount Studios are his music. These are all these horror movies, and that's what modernist music sounds like, you know, to the studio heads.
Once Ernst Krenek settled in Los Angeles, it became very difficult for him to get any attention as a serious music composer. He referred to himself as the world's most forgotten composer.
And he's worried about his family. He had 64 cousins. He's trying to get affidavits for everybody, and that's slowly wearing him down. And by 1940 or so, he's just stopped composing. The other thing is, by the way, in Germany, there was tremendous anticipation about what the new Tach work, what's the new Schoenberg piece, what's the new Hindemith piece. There were festivals. There was a kind of sense, if you go look at the reviews, it was like film reviews in the United States. I mean, there were different competing reviewers, and it really...
Only a few were prepared to deal with the sufferings they had to endure. Suffering makes a strong man stronger, but a weak man weaker. Many went to pot. Most lost their judgment and sense of measure. They took to complaining and bickering. Thrust into uncertain living conditions, they became nervous, quick to quarrel, know-it-alls, like fruit that had been ripped too soon from the vine, dry and bitter. Their misery and despair boiled over into petty, ridiculous squabbles. They rubbed each other the wrong way.
No rifts were harsher than the one between Arnold Schoenberg and Thomas Mann over the character of the composer in Mann's new novel, Dr. Faustus.
Mann wrote Dr. Faustus as an allegory of German insanity, of the genius of Germany, but also the insanity of Germany. And he was using a composer, and the composer supposedly makes a pact with the devil to be able to get a higher level of composition. And the higher level he reaches, after having made a pact with the devil in the form of one night with a prostitute who gives him syphilis, by the way. So now he's got syphilitic genius. And the pact he makes allows him to get to the level where he's basically doing 12-tone composition. The music that's being described is clearly 12-tone.
I think one of the things that he felt so terrible about is that why didn't Thomas Mann, who was, quote, his friend, come to him directly? And of course the reason that Thomas Mann didn't come to him directly is obvious, because he didn't want him to know that it was being associated with this horrible character.
One day in the market here, right here in Brentwood, Schoenberg was marketing with his wife, and he saw Mrs. Mann, and he went up and said in a very loud voice, "I do not have syphilis."
One of the incongruities, these painful incongruities, these depression-inducing incongruities of these people were that they were in paradise. They were desperately, desperately longing for, thinking about the home country, thinking about friends who were trapped. Another damn beautiful morning and still your family is stuck and you're trying desperately to get them out.
How well I remember the evening after the Molotov report came out, when Bertolt Brecht and a friend, Ruth Berlow, were sitting by the fireplace in my home, and I said how guiltily I felt because I had been spared. Next morning, I found under my door a poem Brecht had written. Of course I know, only through luck have I survived so many friends, but last night in a dream, I heard these friends saying of me, "Those who are stronger survive," and I hated myself.
The opera composer Ralph Benatsky was one of the lucky ones. MGM gave him a contract right after he escaped Austria in 1938. But it was an unhappy alliance for them both, and he was let go soon after. He wandered Hollywood for 10 years before he returned to a Europe that had forgotten him. This was one of his first diary entries the year he arrived in Los Angeles. Homesickness takes on complex dimensions. Why, actually, does one feel so discontented here? It doesn't lack anything, thank God. The money is good, the work is satisfying, there is golf and film, cars, colleagues, theaters, bars. What is it then? Because here one is not at home. Every noise one hears outside is foreign and incomprehensible, and one can only understand it after thinking it over. It's the same thing with the newspapers, with the patriotism here, the posters, office signs, signs of every kind. One is definitely foreign, not at home. And though where we came from is 10 times less beautiful, poorer, more boring, more helpless, it isn't far. Is that it? I don't know. All I know is homesickness.
The secret is to be reborn in a new country. Forget what you have been and learn what the natives do. When you know how the natives live and how they accept the country, then you can add later on that culture you have. If you don't do that, you're sunk.
Most of them didn't speak English.
and didn't learn it, and preferred talking to each other. That was another reason why they all congregated. It was easier to speak in the mother language. Then others, of course, especially those who worked in the movies, realized that they had to speak English, and there were some who wouldn't speak a word of German. It was a tragic comedy.
The growing menace of communism aroused...
When the war ended, America's ally, the Soviet Union, became its ideological enemy. Congressional witch hunts focused first on Hollywood and the supposed influence of communism in the film industry. Foreigners were highly suspect.
The blacklist was an abomination. I remember I was at Columbia. I was no longer with MGM. One had to go to one person who was designated to tell you whether you could hire someone or not, a writer, for instance, or anybody. And some people you couldn't hire.
And Salka left here in the early 50s, and she was really driven, in a sense, driven out of here because of McCarthy and what have you. They took away her passport. They did other things to other people. Blacklisting, of course, in Hollywood has a shameful history of that.
Are you now, or have you ever been a communist?
I'm not now a communist, and I remember I made, when I was a young man, 1926, an application for the German communists, but I found out very quick that my artistic activities, I couldn't combine my artistic activities.
And while he vehemently protested that he had never been a member of the Communist Party, the fact remains that he was the brother of a man who was a communist official in Germany.
Left-wing composer Hans Eisler and his wife leave America to avoid deportation proceedings.
I want to thank my many friends, especially distinguished American composers.
I leave this country not without bitterness and regret. I understand when Hitler and his bandits drove me out in 1933, but I am heartbroken to be driven out of this beautiful country in this ridiculous way.
Brecht was summoned in September 1947 to appear with 18 others, writers, actors, and producers, who became known as the Hollywood 19.
Is it true that you have written a number of very revolutionary poems, plays, and other writings?
I have written a number of poems and songs and plays in the fight against Hitler, and
He was thanked for being a cooperative witness and left for Europe the next day, with plane tickets purchased well in advance.
Thomas Mann, although not himself accused, leaves the country in disgust. There's a very famous talk he gives about why he's leaving.
To my mind, the ignorant and superstitious persecution of the believers in a political and economic doctrine is not only degrading for the persecutors, but harmful for the reputation of this country. As an American citizen of German birth, I testify that I am painfully familiar with certain political trends: spiritual intolerance, political inquisitions, and declining legal security, and all in the name of a so-called state of emergency. That is how it started in Germany. I'm attached to our house, to the country and the people, who have remained good-natured and friendly. But the political atmosphere is more and more unbreathable. I let myself break down and weep listening to the Lohengrin prelude. I'm against the ruin that is being brought against America. I'm not against America.
Feuchtwanger told me one day that the reason he didn't go back is that he had received a letter from Thomas Mann advising him not to come back. And the reason, interestingly enough, was for creative reasons. He said, this will cost you 2 years of your life by the time you move and get organized and so forth and start writing again. And incidentally, they were elderly people at this time, and 2 years was a lot of time.
Was ist denn aber nun eigentlich die Tragik der Emigration? Die Tragik der Emigration sind ja nicht die veränderten Berufsumstände oder die täglichen Schwierigkeiten, die man im Beruf hat. Die kann man immer überwinden. Die Tragik besteht in etwas ganz anderem. Des deutschen Dichters Freiherr Börries von Münchhausen, das er vor der Emigration geschrieben hatte, und das hieß Der Auswanderer. Und die letzten 2 Zeilen dieses Gedichtes heißen: Und wenn er dann nach Hause kommt, ist er daheim ein fremder Mann. Das, glaube ich, ist die Tragik der Emigration.
I returned to an unfamiliar world. Sometimes I reflected that if I had known what awaited me in Europe, I might have stayed on in America. But these were random thoughts and brought neither tears nor despair. For I knew that if I had stayed, I would not have known what I now knew. But I also knew that there was no going back. One can never go back. Nothing and no one is ever the same.
There had been a time in the 1930s and 40s when thousands of exiles fleeing Hitler brought the fire of a new, modern aesthetic to Los Angeles and briefly made it one of the capitals of world culture. Then they were gone. It was but a flickering moment in time. Today, only traces remain of a community that once flourished on the western slopes of Los Angeles, an afterglow of their time as shadows in paradise.
The public television broadcast of this program was sponsored by the Lloyd E. Rigler Lawrence E. Deutsch Foundation.